Hey everyone, it's Sam. Recently, I had the chance to chat with Mikael Ljung Aust. He's a cognitive scientist with Volvo Cars, and we talked about how Volvo is developing driver understanding systems. This goes well beyond the driver monitoring systems we have in a lot of vehicles today, like in GM vehicles with Super Cruise and Ford's Blue Cruise system, and BMW and Mercedes have them. This is something quite a bit different. So it's a really interesting conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Bye.
Um, yeah, how much time do you have? No, it's, I'm Mikael Ljung Aust. Michael works well in English. Michel works in French. Mikael in German. I have all of those. I'm with the Safety Center, Volvo Car Safety Center. I'm not an engineer. I'm a cognitive scientist by training. But I do have my PhD from a technical university, so I don't know really how that counts. But I got involved with Volvo 20 years ago, working on and developing accident investigation methodologies if you want to find out why people crash. And not just, but the other part, which is how people get injured. We had been studying that for quite some time, but what actually gets people into trouble was the new thing then. And a lot follows from that, because since then I've spent, my time on three things. One is really what gets people into trouble. And the second is what good are our systems at doing something about that. And third, maybe it's just extension on number two, is really what's the interplay with systems and humans, because we have all these systems and there's just one driver that receives all these inputs, and how do we make sure we, ping them at the right time, stay out of the way otherwise, and generally ensure they trust the car to do the right thing so it can do its thing when needed.
Okay. Well, it's and that that's I think the biggest part of what I wanted to talk about today was the whole the new driver monitoring capabilities that you're building into the EX90, and that I assume will also be in Polestar 3, as far as I can determine so far. Driver monitoring systems are not entirely new, obviously. I mean, we've had them for a number of years now, for the visual distraction component. And I think that part is relatively straightforward, relatively well understood. But if there's anything new that you're doing there, but particularly the cognitive distraction was the thing that caught my attention from that first video that was put out a couple of weeks ago with Jim Rowan. So if you want to dive in and give me some insight as to how you're doing that, kind of what got you to where you are, and how you're doing cognitive distraction detection.
Well, it's going to be a roundabout answer, so you'll have to live with that.
Okay.
But so the main point of the driver understanding system, we kind of dumped the term monitoring because it gives people the wrong impression, and not from the I'm watching you privacy sense, because we do have a lot of respect for data privacy and follow all the rules and have a bunch of our own, but it's more from the functionality. There is more to functionality than sensing. So if you think of collision avoidance, if you slap a radar on the front of the car, that does not magically mean it's going to stop for things that appear in the road. There's a whole lot of things that have to happen in between that and actuation. And it's the same thing here. We have this driver understanding system, and the main point of it is really to be able, well, it does two things. One is to be able to arbitrate if you need help or not. And to do that with a lot higher precision than we've done before. Because I'll assume you're familiar with all of this tech, so you'll know that a collision avoidance algorithm typically says if you're 1 or 2 seconds from crashing, that's not good. we don't think you want to be here because you wouldn't be here otherwise unless you were distracted, so let's assume you are. However, so you have this first line of code that says, we're going to do something if it's 2 seconds until you crash. But then, as lots of testing and practice shows, there's actually a lot of people who are in full control, even if it's just 2 seconds until you crash. Typically, you're only 2 seconds from crashing when overtaking, for example.
Right.
And there's a bunch of these situations. So a typical function description in our place, it has this like the main principle at top, and then it has like 30 or 40 pages of exceptions where that main principle does not apply based on experience and feedback. So one thing we can do with the driver understanding system is take most of those exceptions out and substitute those with a more real-time accurate analysis of whether the driver actually needs help or not. And what is probably less known, that's probably easy to understand, but probably what is less known is that we don't intend to use this to warn or intervene earlier, because many people think that. But if you look at the systems on the market today, both Volvo and others, they have the assumption of distraction or inattention, if you will, cognitive or for whatever reason. They already have that built in, and that's why the warning thresholds are where they are. So a main feature for us is really to be able to wait a little bit. Because if you have someone who's attentive, they don't need that time to look back at the road or snap out of it, depending on why they're not in the loop. And then if they're still not doing something like half a second or 700 milliseconds or 800 milliseconds later, then, we'll warn and intervene. And the advantages of that is that to the person being warned, the situation is a lot more for real because you're actually closer to problem X, but you still have time to deal with it. So it's not more dangerous, but we're taking away, or we aim to take away a lot of what people think are false positives or nuisance warnings or the car meddling when it shouldn't. So that's a big point. And then, of course, comes the tricky question, which is, when does the driver need help? When is it warranted to intervene or warn? And as you said, the visual distraction part, that's easy. If you're looking somewhere else completely, and, that's that. No big deal. If you're staring at thing X, then we can assume you're attentive. But then there's the, cognitive distraction. What if your mind is elsewhere, even if you happen to be staring blankly ahead? Now, a good thing is that I did prepare involuntarily. I just came out of 2 days of driver distraction and inattention conferencing. And one of my PhDs just graduated on the theme of cognitive distraction, so I had to read up on this. But we dug into this cognitive distraction thing, and here, very scientifically, cleanly, if we would define it as, your visual attention is in the right place, but we think your mind is somewhere else than on traffic. If we assume that's the definition we want to work with, then what both the conference showed research from and what my, now she's her own researcher, but my student showed, is that the extent to which you can end up in trouble depend on what kind of trouble you may end up in. So to unpack that a little bit, a lot of what we do when driving is automated. Things you don't have to think about. In principle, actually, the driving school is supposed to not let you out until driving is automated. Now, they use being able to change gears or steer and use the turn indicator as proxies for that, but the intent of driver education is to automate the actual maneuvering of the automobile so you can pay attention to traffic. So we practice a lot. And I look at my numbers in Sweden. I think we do the equivalent of 7,500 or 8,000 miles a year of driving if you're a private car owner. I bet it's a little higher in the U.S.
Yes, between 12 and 15,000 average in the U.S.
A lot more, 50 up, yeah. And at least my average, odometer reading or speed average stays somewhere around 35 on the year basis. It's, it's amazing how slow a lot of this is.
Yeah.
But if I do the math on that, that means I spend roughly like 300 hours a year behind the wheel. And, I'd probably add another hour a day for the US for that. Which means that we're practicing all these basic things with lane keeping and keeping a distance and keeping a speed and slowing down if someone else is slowing down. We practice that an hour or two a day. So, I don't know. You're a musician? Do you play?
I haven't since I was young, but I think I know where you're going with this question.
And you're thinking, I wish I should have stayed on it for that hour a day.
Yeah.
And I'd be in an orchestra by now. So people are really good at, well, I'm not going to say good, but very automated in driving. So what cognitive distraction does when you apply it to people, like when we do our tests, we typically have them do like really evil stuff, like you get a series of numbers read to you and you're supposed to remember like the number 2 numbers back, and if that's identical to the one you hear now, then you're supposed to press a button. That's really
okay.
That's challenging. Or you can count backwards in steps of 7 as fast as you can, starting from 353, go. That's like 353, 348, 341, 334. Yeah,
it's a lot harder than it sounds at first thought.
Yeah. And we have some other, there's a really evil task called shadowing, which is when you put a pair of headphones on someone, and then you have 2 conversations going, one in each ear, different conversations, and then you're supposed to watch for keywords in both conversations and press a button if you hear them. That's pretty much impossible. It's really hard. So when you push those boundaries and really occupy, like, the conscious mind, if you will, the thinking bit, that obviously is not available anymore for driving because it's doing something else, like counting numbers. And what Emma, my student, Emma Nielsen, showed in her thesis and a number of papers is that if the trouble you run into can be solved with automated behaviors, it actually doesn't matter that your mind, your conscious mind, is occupied elsewhere. So when we had, we are cognitive scientists. We like to scare people in a professional way. A lot of what we do is staging situations and make people believe they are about to crash, essentially, and then see how they respond and see if a warning helps or see if cognitive distraction delays your reaction time, that kind of thing. And in her studies, or in our studies, I was actually part of that. We had people doing these really difficult cognitive tasks, but when we had the car in front, like brake out of the blue, there was no difference in response time at all. Huh. People were as fast on the brake when cognitively distracted as if they hadn't been, or the other group that weren't cognitively distracted. So, if you want to sum up the last 12 years or so that we spent in the field, we are a little disappointed because we were hoping to find a very clear definition that's saying that if your mind is elsewhere and here's how we detect it, then that leads to a lot slower response times, and now we have something we can prevent in cars. But we didn't find that. And it's interesting because there have been a bunch of lab studies where you do other types of driving tests and type of reaction tests, and then you put cognitive load on people, and they have showed slowing in reaction times. And we think that the reason is, or why they are showing longer reaction times is that what they have actually asked people to do is another competing conscious activity. So you have to like watch out for brake lights, and as soon as the brake lights go on, you have to tap your own brake. That can be a response in such a study, and that's not something you normally do in traffic. You know, brake lights go on and off all the time. You don't brake just because someone else brakes. Something else determines that, especially whether that other thing is flying at you, you know, brake lights on or not. Mm-hmm. So here we think really it's a bit of a researcher bias. You're really eager to find an effect, and you set up your experiments to maximize that effect. And what sometimes ends up happening is you're testing something that does actually not exist in real driving. So here I think cognitive distraction, there is like one place where you can get into trouble if you're cognitively distracted, and well, as we're thinking of it now anyway, and that's when the situation you're seeing requires reasoning. You have to think it through. And especially if you're inexperienced. So I can take an example. You're heading one direction, and let's say there's a bus heading in the opposite direction, but it's going to turn in front of you in a protected left turn. Then if you're the reasoned or experienced driver, you'll think that, there is a bus turning left in front of me, but there's probably a lane on the outside of that bus going straight. So if both me and the bus are turning, like we're going...
Turning in opposite directions, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There could actually be a vehicle that I can't see because it's behind the bus, but that's going straight and hence has the right of way. And that requires a bit of reason to figure out if you haven't experienced it before. And then when you've been in this situation 100 times, then it's practice and you don't have to think about it. You just do it. And I've actually seen one of these instances myself. I wasn't turning, but there was someone 15-year-old on a moped going left, and you could clearly see the bus about to turn the other direction, this person not thinking about that, and then having to brake very hard and falling over because there was a car popping out from behind the bus. So if you want cognitive distraction to put someone in trouble, then the one you actually can get in trouble is someone inexperienced, like a young driver in a situation they haven't been to before. But those things are pretty rare because we do this 300 or 500 hours a year. Experience builds pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. So it's actually really hard to get drivers in trouble with pure cognitive distraction. There is another proposed mechanism. This is just straight out of the confidence. This is something I wasn't aware of until 2 days ago. But there are some initial, really early days pilot-sized groups, small sample, all the caveats of that, where they also think that, and again, teens, when you start to practice to drive, it takes a while for you to build up this experience and automation of where your safety zone boundaries are and when it's a good thing to let go of the accelerator, all of these basic behaviors. And if you let your mind wander a lot when you're a teen, chances are that your calibration of these margins will be a bit slower. And you may be doing things that you're not thinking about, and since you haven't had the experience yet, those things may not be great at all times, because you don't know better yet. And then, it's not really cognitive distraction per se that we're talking about, as in, thinking really hard about something else. That was more directed at mind wandering, but they were kind of seeing that it was a very fun experiment. They were, giving a bunch of teens yoga classes, meditation classes, focused on here and now kind of things. And the idea is to catch mind wandering and bring you back to the now. And they were kind of early days seeing that if you do that, teens become a little more aware of how they're driving, which, speeds up the learning and avoids potential risk taking because you weren't thinking about it, that kind of thing. But these are like the only two where we see cognitive distraction play into it. So active, like really thinking about something else, that is usually not a problem. But then we have the other version. If you go in the low activity end of the spectrum, like when your brain starts to shut down, I don't know if you would call that like cognitive distraction, or if that's more like drowsiness, being tired, being out of loop, whatnot. But then, of course, if you go all the way to drowsiness, or if you're under the influence of something, then things start happening too. And that's another part of the driver understanding system, is what we're really looking at is very much, when you're no longer driving as normal. So one way to catch that you're not really at your best is really that, because since we're doing all these hours of practice and practice and practice, the way people drive is extremely similar. Now I know
when you say that, is it like for any particular driver, their behavior tends to be consistent, or across many drivers the behavior is consistent?
Both, actually. Okay. It's within and it's between, because it's really, there's only so much you can allow yourself to not stray out of lane. Uh-huh. And there's only so much variability in speed keeping you can do and not violate the flow of traffic. And we practice to those boundaries. So people are, when you look at like steering wheel corrections, when you look at lane keeping metrics, when we look at distance keeping metrics, all of these like physical evidence of how people are driving, you can see that they're extremely similar compared to like any other dimension you can compare people in. From voting and outwards, there's a lot of difference in people, but when it comes to this very mechanical thing, people who learn to do it and who get to stay on the roads do it the same way. And it's not just your hands and feet, it's also the eyes. So the way you use your eyes when driving follows some very universal and like highly detectable patterns. You need to use your eyes in a certain ways to know where the lane's headed, to do vehicle control, to check other stuff. So one thing we can do is put a bounding box around that and say, this is normal. And when that patterns, or those patterns, it's multiple patterns, when they go outside of that box, then we can say, now you're no longer driving like normal. And there can be a million reasons for that, There probably is a few people in the world who can actually get worse at driving because they are thinking hard about something else, even if we haven't found them yet. But it can be sleepiness, it can be because you're sad, it can be because you're super excited, it can be any number of things. But if you're Volvo and if you're looking at it from it like, okay, now what do we do with the vehicle perspective? It's actually enough to say that, well, you left the box. So for us, this is pretty much like a license to intervene, because you're no longer driving like you normally do or like people normally do. And then if problems occur, chances are you won't handle them like you normally do, which means it's on us to do something about it. So I think that's the main point about the driver understanding system. It's really to be able to track in real time, are you still in the zone or not, or in the box or not? And whether you leave that temporarily or longer, doesn't really matter, because that's when we have this concept of a like safe space. You know, you can envision a safe space around the car, and if you are no longer yourself, then responsibility or possibility goes to us to preserve that and make sure it doesn't get annihilated. And then we don't have to wait to that very last millisecond to brake super hard. And this is a philosophy that's actually going into the next generation of cars. Now, how do you regulate if you know this? And as it turns out, you know, when people are not really themselves, one thing they do is kind of forget to do things or delay to do things, which they otherwise normally would have done. And it's not hard and fast stuff. It's like you typically let go of the accelerator if you're approaching someone, you know, to moderate speed a little bit. Or you start to tap the brake very lightly if you're closing in. And what we can do, if you are out of the box and forget to do that, is do that for you. And it doesn't have to be more complicated than that.
Okay.
And same thing, you know, to the sides. It's super simple, really. All there's to it. So that was like the super excursion-y long way saying something about what we do about cognitive distraction.
No, it was great. Yeah, I mean, the background was, you know, not. I mean, I'm an engineer by training. You know, I worked on electronic control systems. My background is not in cognitive science. You know, so it's helpful for me to get that background, you know, on the kinds of things that you've looked at and what you've found. And I guess a little surprising that, you know, a lot of these other factors don't have more of an impact. You know, that sort of the autonomic control of a vehicle, you know, tends to, you know, by drivers tends to come in anyway, even if when drivers are distracted. You know, I would have thought that you know, that there would be less of that, but
it's super strong, and it's surprising to us as well. But it's a little bit like walking. You know, if you're tired, or, you know, had a few beers, or super deep on your phone, people can still walk.
Right.
And very rarely do you see them
breathing
to each other.
You know, I mean, you don't think about breathing. You know.
You'd probably die if you started to.
Yeah.
So it's really those automated, yeah.
It's also worth touching on, perhaps, Mikael, is just sort of the increased amount of distractions that are coming at us just on a daily basis, like with our phones, you know, with driving, and sort of, you know, if you're looking down away from the road, then it knows that you obviously are looking away, going back to that sort of safe space box. Are your eyes looking at the road, or are you sitting texting or watching YouTube? I mean, you see some of these videos of people watching YouTube videos in traffic and things like that. So, yeah, there's just multiple new distractions that are coming to us. So it's, I guess, sort of, yeah, looking at those and just making sure that the car's safe, but just sort of reinforcing that point.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. And an interesting finding, if you like, a bit of surprising trivia, is that some odd 20 years ago, the first naturalistic driving experiment took flight, and that's when you put a bunch of sensors and cameras in people's own cars, and you wave them out the door and say bye-bye and see you in a year. And then you download all the data and see what happened in this year. So there's been a bunch of those studies over the last 20 years. And in those first ones, like Virginia Tech were involved, did something that's known as the 100 car study, if you want to look that up. It's, of course, one thing they looked at was distraction. And this was in the age before smartphones, or real smartphones, if you will. I know this because I have two kids, and one was born in the year of the iPhone, which was 2007, and the other one is born in the year of the iPad, 2010. That was the first iPad, and he cannot believe his sister lived back in the day when there weren't iPads. He's like really old.
Yeah.
But anyway, back in those early 2000s, what they found when looking at gaze patterns in all these videos of people driving was that you spend about 80% of the time driving with your eyes on the road ahead and 20% elsewhere. And there's a very stable pattern to how that shift goes. That's one of the things we're looking at, by the way. But this lists 80-20 share of attention between the road and potential problems and looking at other things. And that can be a speedometer, it can be mirrors, but it can be, well, not back then, phones, but there was a lot of singing, talking, eating, people doing makeup with in-vehicle mirrors, that kind of thing. These kind of studies have continued since my kids were born, so hence into the age of the smartphones and iPads. And what's pretty interesting is that 80-20 number, it's pretty stable. It doesn't change. So our current thinking is really that people are still looking away just as little or just as much. What they look at will have changed because, yes, people do text and drive, we know that. Mm-hmm. But that ratio is still pretty stable. So for us, the real challenge in predicting when is a good time to intervene these days has more to do with, is there a difference if you look away to grab a banana to eat versus is there a difference in looking away to read a text? Because in the one case, maybe your eyes come back to the road pretty quickly and we can leave you at that. In the other case, maybe you get caught out and stuck. And then we have to have a different strategy. So it's more coupled to how easy or hard is it to bring your attention back to a potential problem given what you're spending your time doing with those 20%, even though the ratio is the same. Which is pretty interesting research and which we're having dialogues with all our, we're partnering with some known names in vehicle or display technology like Google and Apple and those kind of guys. And it really, it's moving from this, are you looking at the road or not, versus what are the odds you've forgotten what you saw on the road depending on what you're doing next, and when will you come back depending on what you're doing off-road. And how can we use that to make sure we ping you when we need, but stay back when we don't, because with this amazing exterior sensing capability that's now coming to cars, I think largely due to a lot of promise in autonomous driving, a lot of beefy sensor sets are making their way onto cars, and with that comes a lot of expectation to act, because now you have this very beefy sensor set that should be able to do a lot of things. So for us, it's pretty lucky that we have, a real-time driver understanding system, so we can hopefully arbitrate in better ways than by chance when it's a good time to intervene, because otherwise we have the potential risk that the user experience is not going to be all that great. It may be a lot of people want to do a lot of good, but the sum of all that may be a less than fantastic experience. So it's one of these, the road to hell paved with good intentions. So we're really fortunate to have, launching a driver understanding system at the same time as we're launching this super capable sensor set to pretty much deal with the fallout.
Yeah.
If you will.
Yeah. The user experience part of this, is a very important component. I was just spent the past week driving a Ford vehicle, that, has, when you're driving it with the adaptive cruise control, it is using the torque sensor in the steering wheel to try to detect if your hands are on the wheel. And the way they've got it calibrated is very bad, because it's constantly giving false alerts to put your hands on the wheel, even when my hands are on the wheel. If I'm driving on a straight stretch of highway, the presumption is that, when you're driving, there's always a little bit of motion from your hands. If I'm driving on a straight stretch of highway and holding my hands fairly steady and the wheel is steady, that mechanism can't detect that my hands are actually on the wheel. A capacitive sensor would know my hands are on the wheel, but that torque sensor doesn't. And so it's constantly throwing me these alerts. And so you have to wiggle the wheel to tell it, yeah, my hands are on the wheel. And, that's actually worse. So, I think it's worse for safety and it's a worse user experience. So I think, if you have a more, robust mechanism for detecting that, for understanding what the driver's current state is, then using that as one of the signals to determine when other systems might need to intervene, whether that's just an alert to the driver or, some sort of active intervention, with the brakes or steering or any other, actuator on the vehicle, I think, should help to provide both a safer and better user experience.
I think you pretty much nailed it, and you'll be happy to know we have a capacitive steering wheel coming up in the X90. But
yeah, I saw that. I think that was in one of the releases.
Yeah, but I think it's this exactly what you're on. There'll be a higher precision to what we do. It's exactly this. What I said at the beginning, those 40 pages of guessing when or estimating when we shouldn't meddle. Mm-hmm. We can throw those out and replace them with real-time sensing. That is like big leap forward. And interesting part is you can be a lot faster because in the capacitive sense, right away. Mm-hmm. So the feedback loop to the driver becomes much shorter. It's like, hey, keep your hands on the wheel. You can say that 10 milliseconds later if you want. So the driver will know exactly what the car wants to do. And if you want to have feedback loops to people, one thing that research has shown is that they need to be clear and fast. It needs to be something you can do about it. You can't come a year later and say, do you remember that drive you had? You weren't really holding the wheel, so now we're deducting points from your insurance or something. That's like, now you're just being mean and there's nothing I can do about it.
It's like training your dog. If the dog does something you don't want them to do, you have to respond right then, because a minute later they won't, if you tell them no, they won't know why you're telling them not to do.
There's no connection.
Yeah.
No, whatsoever. That's the problem in developing a good safety score. Also, if, you follow these approaches, because, what will change if I change my behavior, and how do I know that was the behavior that changed it? That's a real challenge in those type of feedback systems. So here we have
correlating your behavior with the score when they're asynchronous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think what we have here is and what we're really looking to do is to level up on precision. So we'll be more precise when to intervene, both in terms of staying out of the way, but also in terms of speeding up the feedback loop. Because at the end of the day, if people don't trust the cars, if they don't trust the systems, they're not going to do as asked or keep them on, or they will do something else rather than what the system wants, which is also a way to end up in trouble if you have emergency stuff going on. So I think you can't really partition perceived safety or perceived or a safe user experience from real safety going forward. They will go hand in hand, and if you don't have the driver's trust and the driver's feeling that this car knows what it's doing and actually is doing it in a good way, then you won't get the benefits of all the safe tech either, because they will be codependent when we start interacting with the driver more.
Did you know you can support Wheel Bearings directly? Head to patreon.com/wheelbearingsmedia and you can become a patron today. Your contributions will help fund the platforms and tools we use to bring the podcast to you. And exclusives and improvements are already on the way thanks to your generosity. So if you want to be part of an automotive podcast like no other, head to patreon.com/wheelbearingsmedia.
Just to make sure I understand what you just said, if the perceived safety and the real safety are if the real safety is working too well, the driver becomes codependent. So are you saying that that's when you start to get into the driver complacency problem, where it's good most of the time, or works most of the time, or I guess I'm not quite sure.
No, not really the complacency problem. It's more like the for an optional system like lane keeping aid, we're not. You can decide whether it's on or off, and
right.
If it's a good user experience. Now, if you look at crash statistics, you'll maybe need that once or twice in a lifetime, to avoid something super serious. But since we don't know when that once in a lifetime is going to happen, it needs to stay on
right.
to do its thing. And if you hate it because it annoys the hell out of you, then it won't stay on.
Right.
So it's that very simple mechanism. And as we add, layers of systems or increases capabilities of functions and more engineers can do cool and clever stuff, then, there's the number of situations where we could, go poke you with the car will grow exponentially.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't have those interactions right, and if we don't have a good gatekeeping system in place which says that, yeah, you could ping the driver now, I understand you're worried about situation X, but actually the driver is on top of it. And they've done this before, and so chill. Wait a bit. Then we're going to have a super annoying car that's, that co-driver or backseat driver that you really...
Yeah. Okay.
And we can, it would be easy if we could force people to stick with Volvo and never change. That would be, then we could be another type of brand. But this is customer experience. People have to want this, and they have to like this, and they have to stay safe at the same time. So we can't do away with user experience. It's going to be core. And it's also, I think, because the tech is getting more and more complex, it's going to be harder and harder to explain what it actually does.
Mm-hmm.
The sensor fusion between LiDAR and radar and camera, I still have a hard time wrapping my head around that. How does that work in practice? Which lines of code go where, and what do they do exactly? What's fusion? They're looking at completely... anyway, so if you're the dealer and want to say this to people, chances are you won't really come across. And they need a surrogate. They need a stand-in. They need something that can actually work when you try to pitch that this car is really safe. And then you can actually say this car will feel really safe. And that's because it is.
Uh-huh.
And it will feel great because it is. It's a strong mapping with what, your experience of this drive corresponds to what the car actually can do. And that's where we want to be. It's just like kind of a luxury thing, actually. I had a wonderful talk with a lady who writes for a women's magazine in Ireland a couple of months back on a similar topic. And it's like, when we've been at this for a while, she said, well, that's interesting. It's like you're describing a meaningful husband. Someone with the good sides, but not the bad sides, and who actually offers to help only when needed.
Mm-hmm.
And that is actually what you expect because you're in this relationship. That's what you expect of your partner. So, in essence, in luxury or premium kind of sense, you're paying the car to watch out for that one time when you happen to have a bad moment. And because it will, you don't have to worry about it. And that's where, all the extra go. So it's a rather different take on it. It was a very funny metaphor.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great metaphor. Another example, is when you're eating at a restaurant, and the staff, you don't want waiters hovering over you all the time as you're enjoying your meal, but at the same time, you want them to be aware, if your water glass is empty, and you need a refill or, something like that, so you're not trying to get someone's attention when you need it, but at the same time, you have what you need all the time.
Exactly. And they can, I don't go to super high-end restaurants often, but, the few times I've done, they have this, like, magic capability of entering the conversation and asking whether you need something without interrupting the flow, which is pretty weird when you look at that's like a super skill that I don't have, or a superpower.
I think the experience I have more often is that they seem to be standing there waiting until you put some food in your mouth to come over and ask you, is there anything else I can get you, just as you're shoveling food in your mouth. Yeah. And that's kind of like the lane keeping systems we have on a lot of vehicles today that are constantly pestering you if you edge a little bit too close to the edge of the lane. Or the Ford's, keep your hands on the wheel, sensing, where it's more of an annoyance than an actual assistance. And I think this is a fascinating approach to take to it, using the driver understanding to know, to try to capture the driver's state of mind and be able to intervene only when they actually need help, as opposed to constantly being there making little adjustments.
Yeah, I think that's the key, because only then can we keep the actual dialogue down to a reasonable level and not be, like this. You could be a lot more in the center. It's like Rain Man, at the end of this. You could be driving more optimally. You could be driving more optimally. You could be like, it's like, it's fun for 10 seconds. Yeah. So I think that's where we want to be. It's like powering up with all this stuff in order to take a step back. But be sure we're right when we step in.
So going back a little bit to kind of how you're doing the detection of the driver understanding. In the EX90, you got two cameras looking at the driver from different angles. And you talked about the eye movements generally being very consistent from driver to driver, so you can understand what is the pattern that you want. You know what the optimal pattern of movements is, which I presume includes some scanning of the road, some scanning of the mirrors, looking straight ahead, and some combination of those things. So are you using the combination of the cameras at different angles to detect the driver's head pose as well as eye position, and then using some machine learning algorithm to try to match is the driver's pattern what it should be, and then if it's not, if it's outside of that bounding box, then to make some decisions about, okay, here's when we might want to alert them or intervene.
That's pretty much it. Now, the only reason any single camera system can do that whole thing with, where's, and that's where the machine learning parts comes in, where is gaze directed, how is it moving about, where's the head going. The Euro NCAP has a funny distinction in their upcoming tests between owls and lizards, where, people who are owls, they move their whole head, whereas lizards, they just move the eyes. So, you'll see gaze go down there, but the head is pointing straight. So there's a bit of funny interaction there. But any single camera system can do that. The reason we have two cameras is because people put their hands in the way or wave about or turn their heads. So if you want uptime, if you want to be able to track continuously, we think you need two cameras to do that robustly. That's at least our assumption, so that's why we're putting that in. If time tells that one is enough, then no one would be happier than us. We'll throw one out, make it cheaper. But for now, we think two cameras is what you need to. If you're going to make it standard, and which we are doing, and cover that whole angle and lots of people, you need two. So it's really widening the angle, viewing angle, and then all what they say in machine learning, feature extraction that happens with AI and machine learning and any tool that clever computer scientists can get their hands on. Mm-hmm. But then we're back to the, Finding Nemo problem at the end of the movie, where you have those 5 fishes. They escaped from the aquarium in a plastic bag each, so they're sitting in this plastic bag on top of the ocean and saying, now what? So a lot of our work and my department go into researching, now what? Now, what do we do with this? If we have perfect tracking of where your eyes go at any given time, and that's where we enter into these, like, okay, so there's a pattern to how normal driving goes for eyes and for head poses, and if you fall out of that, and then obviously there's other use cases, like if you fall out of frame, like literally, then we know you're probably not attentive on the road anymore. That's one of these sudden sickness or other types of cases. Or if both of your eyes are fully closed, that's you sleeping, or at least not being able to react if something pops up. So there is all these other use cases that come up as well. But generally, it really comes down to define what's normal and where's the bounding box limit that lets us decide you're outside of normal.
Okay. Great. Well, I'm really looking forward to trying this out. I think this is going to be fascinating to see how it compares to other systems that are out there, and seeing how, what the experience is like with the EX90 and the Polestar 3. Because I think you're doing some very, very interesting things, and I've long been a proponent of this idea of understanding, trying to understand what the driver's state is. And there's been a variety of different, efforts to do that over the years, in addition to the infrared cameras we have today. So, I think I agree that I think that it's a very important part of improving safety, is to understand what the driver's condition is. Let's put it that way. And
I completely agree. And for us, it's definitely a very straight shortcut to more intelligent ADAS in that sense.
Yeah.
And this possibility to, if you're dropping into these states that are outside and non-transient things that stay on, you're really sleepy, we know you're sleepy, that doesn't change, like the non-transient stuff. That's also great. And it's also, I think it's only fair. We should take the driver's competence and experience into account before we actually start to meddle. It's there's a fairly well-known UX researcher and professor called Donald Norman. He's written a bunch of funny books, where engineers get things wrong, basically. There's one you can look up. It's the design of everyday things, and I think on the cover it has a teapot which has the sprout and the handle in the same direction.
Yeah.
Like that kind of thing. And he was consulting for Ford for a while, and it was this very funny interview when he was in a car saying to someone else, they were sitting in this car interview setting, saying that, well, actually the most important thing which we should do is to start engineering cars for people as they are and not as engineers think they should be. Yeah,
no, that's a great point, and that goes back several years back, as kind of the whole automated driving effort was starting to take off. There's a researcher or a PhD and he's now a venture capitalist, Andrew Ng, who talked about, to enable autonomous vehicles, we need to get pedestrian behavior to change, to get people to stop jaywalking, in order to make these things work. It's like, no, that's wrong. The system has to work within the bounds of what humans do, no matter what kind of system it is. You have to take into account human behavior in designing your product in order to make it work. So.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating. There's so many people who say the only thing we need to change is the person, make them do better. But when you do the math on how often people actually make mistakes that they can't correct for, and which ends up in a crash, that failure rate is usually a lot lower than the failure rate we have for our absolutely best industrial production processes.
Mm-hmm.
If I was to ask our suppliers, like, we'll order 50, every rear view mirror in the future, or whatever the surrogate of that would be in the future, will come from you. And, let's order 40 million and
oops. Oh. Froze right at the last minute.
I thought it was my internet there, but let's just wait and see if Mikael comes back. You can actually save that as a background.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was.
Oh, there we go. Got you back.
Sorry. Now I was saying if you have one faulty component in 40 million, then we get the whole lot for free. They would probably say no.
Right. Yeah,
I think that's somewhere if you.
And to your point about
error, that's how frequent it is.
Yeah, and to your point about the frequency of errors that the human drivers can't recover from. This is a statistic that I often quote in talks and presentations I give. You often hear the statistic, 94% of crashes, are the result of human error, which is only partially true. Human error is a component in those. But when you look at it from the reverse side, here in the U.S., we drive 3.2 trillion miles a year and have about 6.5 million crashes, which is works out to about one for every driver, about one crash every 500,000 miles, which is about one crash every 30 years on average for human drivers.
That's pretty steep.
And, so when you look at, 40,000 plus fatalities a year is unacceptable, and we need to improve on that. But when you look at how much we do this task and how infrequently we actually crash or die, we're actually surprisingly good at it, much better at it than most people realize. And so the threshold for any mechanical system to improve on that is extremely high, at least on average. There are obviously certain scenarios where automation can be much better than we are.
Yeah.
And there's other scenarios where it's going to be very hard to be better than humans. So, well, I really appreciate your time today. This has been very enlightening. And hopefully we can talk again sometime. And I'm looking forward to seeing, to experiencing the results of your work.
Likewise. And, ping me or ping Ian. He's probably better at setting these things up than I am.
All right.
Yeah, please do. If there's anything, any follow-up questions or if you want to make some more time, Sam, just drop us a note.
Okay.
Happy to oblige.
All right. Well, thank you so much and have a great day.
Cool. You too.
All right.
Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye.